What if I told you that a single decision made decades ago still shapes your paycheck today? Imagine you wake up tomorrow to a financial disaster, an unexpected medical bill, a lost job, or a sudden market crash. Would you be ready, or would you scramble to make ends meet? Now, picture this. You've spent years building your career, you've made smart investments, but a single catastrophe can still derail everything. The truth is, our financial futures are not just shaped by our own choices, but by decisions made long before we were born. Global economic events, shifting policies, and historical financial crises have created the landscape we navigate today. And within this landscape lies one critical decision you can make right now to change your life forever: building an emergency fund. In today's video, we're diving deep into one of the most critical aspects of financial security: the emergency fund. Why do you need it? How did the concept evolve? And why is it more important now than ever before? Over the next few minutes, we'll break down the historical roots of financial safety nets, reveal how they evolved into the concept of emergency funds, and explore why modern financial instability makes them absolutely essential today. Understanding the history of financial systems, the evolution of personal finance practices, and the global forces that shape our world will equip you with the knowledge you need to make smarter, more informed financial decisions. The choices made by governments, institutions, and individuals decades ago continue to echo in our wallets today. By recognizing how the past has shaped our present, we'll see why the emergency fund is no longer optional. It's a necessity. Part 1. Historical roots. Let's rewind the clock and step back into a time when the financial safety nets we take for granted today didn't even exist. Imagine the early 20th century, a time when the American dream was defined by self-reliance, hard work, and community support. If you found yourself in a tough spot, you were expected to rely on family, neighbors, or your church to help you get back on your feet. But this ideal of independence would be violently challenged in the 1930s. The Great Depression of 1929 was a momentous turning point in American history, forever altering the way people viewed their financial security. It wasn't just a downturn, it was a catastrophic economic collapse that left millions of Americans out of work, facing widespread poverty and struggling to survive. Unemployment rates soared to nearly 25%, and the stock market crash wiped out entire savings accounts overnight. Banks failed, businesses crumbled, and the American middle class was decimated. People who had lived comfortably in the roaring 1920s found themselves begging for scraps, standing in breadlines, and losing everything they had worked for. In the midst of this chaos, the American public's faith in the economy, in their own ability to survive financially, and in the idea of self-sufficiency was shattered. Suddenly, it became painfully clear that relying solely on personal resilience was not enough in the face of such widespread economic collapse. In fact, many Americans found themselves with no resources at all to fall back on: no savings, no job, no safety net. This was the birth of the modern financial crisis, one that would push policymakers and economists to reconsider the foundations of financial stability. It was against this backdrop of despair that the idea of savings, specifically emergency savings, began to take root. The concept of an emergency fund slowly emerged from the rubble of the Great Depression. But it wasn't just a personal financial strategy, it became a national imperative. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies aimed to stabilize the economy and alleviate the suffering of the American people. One of the most significant steps was the creation of Social Security in 1935, which provided financial assistance to retirees and the unemployed. Social Security was a bold move, signaling a shift from individual self-reliance to a government-backed safety net. For the first time, it was clear that the government had a role to play in ensuring the economic well-being of its citizens. This shift didn't happen overnight, of course. The idea of relying on savings and personal responsibility would take time to take hold. But in the wake of the Great Depression, it became abundantly clear that the previous way of thinking, relying solely on family, community, or a job for security, was not sustainable in the modern world. Personal savings, and particularly emergency funds, became the foundation of financial responsibility for generations to come. Meanwhile, the families of America, still reeling from the fallout of the Depression, had to rethink their approach to saving. In the post-Depression world, people started to ask themselves, what if something like this happens again? The need for an emergency fund became a central question for financial planners. But it wasn't just about surviving economic downturns. It was about rethinking how to handle personal finances in a rapidly changing world. The aftermath of the Great Depression set the stage for an entirely new way of thinking about savings and financial security. Part 2, the rise, the shift. Let's move into the post-Great Depression era, the 1940s and beyond. World War II had just ended, and America was emerging as the world's new economic powerhouse. The war effort had spurred massive industrial production, and the U.S. economy quickly transitioned from wartime to peacetime production. The prosperity of the 1950s was felt across much of the country. For many, it seemed like the American dream was finally achievable on a wide scale. Homes were built in the suburbs, new cars rolled off assembly lines, and mass consumerism was born. But while the economic boom of the post-war era provided opportunities for millions, it also brought about new financial challenges. Americans' spending power increased, and with that came rising consumer debt. For many, borrowing became a way of life. The credit card, for example, became an essential part of American life during this time, allowing people to buy goods they might not have been able to afford otherwise. But it also led to a new kind of financial instability. People were living on credit and often not saving enough for the unexpected. At the same time, inflation began to rise as a consequence of the increased demand for goods and services, and the U.S. government had to adjust monetary policies to keep up. Job instability also emerged as a concern. The 1950s and 1960s were marked by economic booms, but these booms were also punctuated by periods of economic recessions. Companies went bankrupt, the stock market fluctuated, and people faced job loss and wage cuts. In many ways, this was a preview of the financial instability that would follow. Fast forward to the 1970s. The world's economy was facing a perfect storm. The OPEC oil embargo caused energy prices to soar, and inflation ran rampant, reaching its highest levels in decades. It wasn't just the cost of gas that was rising, the cost of everything was skyrocketing. This period, known as stagflation, was marked by high unemployment, stagnant economic growth, and rising prices. It was a time when many Americans realized just how fragile their financial positions were. For the first time in decades, it wasn't clear whether the American middle class would continue to thrive. The 1970s marked the point where financial security and savings were no longer seen as optional. They became a necessity for survival. And as the instability of the decade became apparent, the importance of having an emergency fund was realized on a larger scale. People started to understand that the economy wasn't as predictable as they had once assumed, and their financial futures could no longer rest solely on their ability to get by day to day. The idea of emergency savings as a means of protecting oneself from life's inevitable disruptions, whether economic downturns, job loss, or unforeseen expenses, began to take center stage. But the true transformation didn't come until the 1980s. In the wake of the economic chaos of the 1970s, the government began to implement more conservative fiscal policies, and financial planning became an increasingly popular topic in the media. Personal finance books, television programs, and radio shows began to emphasize the importance of managing one's finances more carefully, advocating for the need to save, and above all, to protect oneself with an emergency fund. A generation of financial planners, including the likes of Dave Ramsey, began to push this message to the masses. The tools and strategies for financial planning were no longer reserved for the wealthy. They were aimed at the everyday person, trying to navigate the ups and downs of the modern financial landscape. The growing popularity of 401ks and other retirement accounts in the 1980s also contributed to this shift in financial thinking. The idea that people should be responsible for their own financial future, rather than relying on their employer's pension or government assistance, became mainstream. By the 1990s, the idea of having an emergency fund became firmly entrenched in personal finance culture. Yet even as financial literacy was becoming a key focus, Americans were still facing instability. The 1990s were marked by bursts of economic growth, followed by recessions and the dot-com bubble bursting in the early 2000s. But despite these setbacks, the message that an emergency fund was essential for financial survival had become clear. By the time the 2008 financial crisis struck, the idea of an emergency fund had become ingrained in the national conversation. The housing bubble had inflated housing prices to unsustainable levels, and people took on more mortgage debt than they could realistically afford. When the market crashed, millions of Americans found themselves without jobs, without homes, and in many cases, without savings. It was a harsh reminder of the volatility of the financial world, and for those who had an emergency fund, it was a lifeline. They could weather the storm. But for those who hadn't saved, it became a financial disaster that would take years to recover from. The rise of the emergency fund had reached a critical point by the 2008 crisis, and it became universally acknowledged that without savings, one could not weather the unpredictable storms of modern financial life. The collapse of financial institutions, the foreclosures, the massive layoffs, all underscored the importance of having a financial cushion to absorb the shocks of the world. People were no longer just saving for retirement or big purchases. They were saving to survive. The economic recovery from the 2008 crisis proved that emergency savings were no longer just about planning for the future. They were about ensuring financial survival. Part 3. Modern implications. Now, let's look at how the evolution of the emergency fund impacts us today. If the rise of the emergency fund was fueled by financial crises, economic instability, and shifting societal norms, then the modern era is defined by a new set of challenges. The world we live in today is even more uncertain than the one that saw the 2008 crisis. From the rise of gig work and the decline of traditional job security to the unpredictable fluctuations in global markets, there has never been a time when financial safety has felt more elusive. In the past decade alone, we've witnessed everything from a global pandemic that upended entire industries to the sudden collapse of major financial institutions. The COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, exposed just how fragile many people's financial situations are. Millions of Americans were laid off, furloughed, or had their hours reduced. And while some were fortunate enough to have government assistance, others found themselves scrambling without an emergency fund to fall back on. Some even resorted to credit cards to survive. Take the story of Julia, a freelance graphic designer in New York City. When the pandemic hit, she lost 80% of her clients overnight. With rent in Manhattan skyrocketing, she realized that her emergency savings, which she had been building over the years, were the only thing keeping her afloat. Without her savings, she would have had no way to cover basic living expenses. Fortunately, she had been advised early on by a financial planner to put away 6 months' worth of expenses, something many people do not do. Then there's Mark, a 35-year-old engineer living in Texas who had always followed traditional financial advice. Mark had built a small emergency fund of about $10,000, but when a layoff hit his company unexpectedly, he was forced to tap into his savings. The good news is that Mark had the emergency fund to keep him afloat while he searched for new opportunities. However, without it, he would have been left in financial limbo, struggling to make ends meet during a time of tremendous uncertainty. The difference between Julia and Mark, and countless others without an emergency fund, lies in how they were able to respond to life's unexpected shocks. Today's financial landscape, shaped by technological disruption, inflation, and economic uncertainty, underscores the necessity of having an emergency fund. In a world where job stability is often temporary and financial shocks are more common than ever, building an emergency fund is no longer just prudent, it's essential. In fact, the modern financial expert's recommendation is to aim for at least 3 to 6 months' worth of living expenses in a liquid, easily accessible account. The goal isn't just survival, it's to give you the breathing room to make decisions without the overwhelming pressure of financial ruin. Whether you're facing a job loss, a medical emergency, or any other unexpected expense, The emergency fund ensures that you can weather the storm without falling into debt. Today, more than ever, building an emergency fund is an essential step toward financial resilience. The unpredictability of the world is no longer a theory, it's a fact of life. And the ability to absorb those shocks, to maintain your financial stability when everything else feels like it's crumbling, is a power that no one can take away from you. Part 4. The Unseen Story. Now, let's dive into a lesser-known truth about emergency funds, one that financial experts often don't highlight, but which is crucial in understanding their broader impact. Having an emergency fund isn't just about surviving tough times. It's about empowerment. It's about having the freedom to make decisions without the overwhelming pressure of financial insecurity. In fact, having an emergency fund can even influence your career, your lifestyle choices, and your mental health in ways that go beyond the obvious financial benefits. Most people think of an emergency fund strictly as a buffer for unexpected expenses, a medical emergency, job loss, or car repair. But the true power of an emergency fund lies in the psychological and personal freedom it provides. Without it, you're constantly living in fear of the unknown, always wondering how you'll handle that next financial setback. But with an emergency fund, you're not just bracing for disaster, you're prepared. And that preparation can allow you to make better decisions in all areas of your life. Consider the case of Sarah, a 28-year-old marketing executive in Los Angeles. Sarah had been working at a high-pressure job for years, living paycheck to paycheck, putting in long hours, and feeling the constant stress of living without an emergency fund. But one day, after several months of reflection, Sarah decided to make a bold move. She left her corporate job to pursue her passion for starting a small business in graphic design. It was a risky move, one that could easily have backfired. But because she had spent the last 2 years building up her emergency fund, she was able to step away from a stable, albeit stressful job and focus on her passion without the looming fear of financial ruin. Her emergency savings gave her the confidence to take the leap. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving and living life on your own terms. An emergency fund can allow you to make these types of decisions, free from the financial stress that might otherwise keep you trapped in a situation you're not happy with. But what's even more intriguing is that in times of economic uncertainty, when everyone else is panicking, those who have an emergency fund can act with calm and clarity. Whether that means negotiating a better deal, taking advantage of investment opportunities, or simply choosing to ride out a storm without fear of losing everything. But here's the catch. While building an emergency fund can bring freedom, lack of savings can make you more vulnerable to exploitation. This is where the unseen, darker side of financial insecurity comes into play. When you're financially vulnerable, you're more likely to make hasty decisions based on fear, such as accepting unfavorable job offers, going deeper into debt, or making impulsive financial choices in an attempt to escape your situation. This opens the door for predatory financial schemes, high-interest loans, payday lending traps, and debt cycles that only worsen your situation. And then there's the quiet epidemic of mental health issues associated with financial insecurity. Studies have shown that financial stress can lead to anxiety, depression, and even physical health problems. People without an emergency fund often feel overwhelmed with the constant anxiety of, what happens if I lose my job? Or what if I can't afford medical treatment? This kind of stress, over time, takes a significant toll on both mental and physical health. In contrast, people with an emergency fund often report lower levels of financial stress, better sleep, and improved overall well-being. They can focus on building long-term wealth, investing in their future, and achieving their personal goals without constantly worrying about survival. But there's an even more surprising angle: emergency funds and societal systems. You might not think it, but emergency funds have broader societal implications. Imagine a world where more people were financially stable enough to handle economic crises on their own. How would that change the way our society functions? What if individuals could weather personal storms without needing government bailouts, credit card companies, or high-interest loans to survive? The truth is that the more people who have financial security, the more resilient the society becomes. Emergency funds, in essence, contribute to the stability of the economy by reducing reliance on external help. When individuals are not drowning in debt or living paycheck to paycheck, they are more likely to be contributors to the economy rather than liabilities. They're more likely to start businesses, invest in their communities, and participate in long-term economic growth. By investing in emergency savings, individuals are not only protecting themselves, but they're also contributing to a more sustainable and resilient society. As we wrap up today's discussion, the question remains: how will you respond when life throws its inevitable curveballs? In a world of constant change, economic unpredictability, and personal upheaval, an emergency fund isn't just a luxury, it's a tool of empowerment. It's the key to financial freedom and security, offering a safety net that allows you to make better choices for your future. Now, whether it's transitioning careers, making strategic investments, or even taking a break to recharge. But more than that, it's about having the confidence to live life on your own terms, knowing that you're prepared for whatever comes your way. Whether it's a small setback or a major financial disaster, your emergency fund ensures that you can face life's challenges without the constant fear of financial instability. The lessons of history remind us that the future is never certain. But there is one decision you can make today that will provide you with peace of mind in the years to come. Build your emergency fund. The past may be over, but its lessons continue to shape our financial futures. The power to protect yourself from the financial storms ahead lies in the choices you make now. The question is, are you ready to take that first step? The past may be over, but its shadow is where our money sleeps. What will you do today to ensure that your money stays protected?